One of the most important priorities for parents is to always ensure the safety of their children, to provide them with a stable home in which to make memories, to have fun, and to just be kids. It's even better if, as a parent, you can find the home of your dreams, something reasonably priced, idyllic in nature, out in the countryside, but not too far removed from society. You find this home and are so excited to finally make it yours, but from the moment you cross the threshold, you know something isn't quite right. You and your family are not the only inhabitants living in the home. It is haunted by those who once lived and died there, and things so unspeakable they have never had an earthly presence. Things are happening that you have no explanation for, and shortly thereafter, those things, malevolent in nature, begin to make you the object of their torment. This was the story of Carolyn Perron, her husband Roger, and their children for the span of a decade. A story now with a newfound popularity from a movie release, giving it a name known far and wide. This week's story is the haunting of the Perron family at their farm on Round Top Road, a story that has since become known as the Conjuring. Hi there, my name is Nick, and I'd like to thank you for tuning back into a new chapter of the Insidious Agenda podcast. I'm certainly glad you came back. On this week's episode, we're going to discuss the events surrounding the haunting of the Perron family, so ensure you're subscribed so you don't miss any of the weekly exciting episodes to come. Before I get into the story of the Perron family, I wanted to preface it by saying that I'll get into a few stories from the hauntings of the Perrons during their time in their home. However, this will fit in more with a sequence of events rather than things happening event by event, owing to the fact they were there for a decade, and so many terrifying things happened to their family. I don't want to detract from the complete and true story. For an entire recounting of events, I highly recommend you read the 3-volume series House of Darkness, House of Light, which was written by the eldest of Roger and Carolyn's children, Andrea Perron. She tells stories in there that are outrightly chilling and lie on the borders of surreal. And though her book series is as accurate of a retelling as there's ever going to be, Andrea once said, there are stories of events her family experienced that will never be told again. Now turn down your lights, close your eyes, let things go quiet, and just listen for a moment. Let your mind wander, and remember, you're never alone. Now follow along to the sound of my voice as we pull up the gravel driveway and open the doors of the farm on Round Top Road once again. Before we get into the Perron haunting, I believe it's finally time to learn a bit more about Ed and Lorraine Warren, who they were, and how they became the recognized demonologists that they had been. Edward Warren Miney was born on the 7th of September, 1926, in Bridgeport, Connecticut. His future wife, Lorraine Rita Moran, was born less than a year later, on the 31st of January, 2006, in Monroe, Connecticut. When he was a young boy, Ed's fascination with the paranormal began, for he grew up in what he believed was a haunted house. He would often recount memories of doors opening and closing on their own, and made note of strange lights that would appear within the house. Lorraine, a proclaimed clairvoyant, would recognize her gifts beginning at the young age of 9. The first experiences with her gifts was when she began to notice auras around people, but she didn't pay it much mind as she thought it was normal. The pair would meet in 1944 at the Colonial Theater when Ed was working as an usher. Shortly after their meeting, Ed would enter military service with the United States Navy during World War II at the age of 17. A few months into his service, the ship on which Ed was stationed collided with an oil tanker somewhere in the North Atlantic. A large fire broke out, and after attempting to battle the blaze, the ship's company was forced to abandon the vessel. Ed, while adrift in the Atlantic, would pray that another ship would soon come along to help and the surviving members would be rescued. When he returned home from service, Ed proposed to Lorraine. She would accept, and the pair were married in 1945. Following his service, Ed enrolled at the Perry Art School, a subsidiary of Yale. On the 11th of January 1946, Ed and Lorraine would welcome their daughter and only child Judy into the world. Following the completion of his schooling in art, Ed attempted to make a living as a painter. The couple would travel all around New England, attempting to sell Ed's paintings, which were inspired by the paranormal and haunted locations. Ed and Lorraine would do good amounts of research on any homes that they suspected to be haunted. When they discovered which places they wanted to check out, they would drive out to the location and Ed would paint or sketch those homes. Lorraine would be the one to go to the door and offer Ed's works for a chance to gain entry into the home. These paintings were their segue into the life of paranormal research they came to be known for. Ed and Lorraine were both devout Catholics. Ed would become a self-taught demonologist, eventually becoming recognized as the only Catholic expert on the subject. Well, the only subject who wasn't a priest. Lorraine, with her gifts of clairvoyance, was able to communicate with ethereal spirits and other paranormal entities. Together, they founded the New England Society for Psychic Research in 1952. Through this, they would begin paranormal investigations into many cases which they accepted for no money. Their remunerations would normally come instead from licensing rights for books, movies, various lectures, and tours of their occult museum. One of their more famous investigations, when they really came into the spotlight, was when they received reports of a doll that exhibited unexplained behavior. It was said to move on its own and reportedly attacked a friend of the owners. The owners of the doll believed it was inhabited by the spirit of a young girl named Annabelle Higgins. During their investigation, the Warrens determined that the doll wasn't acting on its own, but was in fact possessed, doing the strange things it did by means of an outside force, an inhuman presence. After an exorcism was performed on the doll, the Warrens took it back with them to their home in Monroe, Connecticut, where it was placed in their occult museum. Today, the famous Annabelle doll sits in a box with a glass front. attached is a sign with red lettering, which reads, "Warning, positively do not open." The next major investigation they took part in is the subject of this episode. However, first, I'll wrap up this short biography of Ed and Lorraine before we progress into the Perron story. The Warrens would take part in many investigations over the course of their career. They would have taken part in what they claim almost 10,000 investigations. Towards the end of their careers, they would focus on passing on their knowledge of the occult, continuing to host lectures across the United States. They would press on, sharing their wealth of knowledge with the public, even though they were never without their skeptics. On the 23rd of August in 2005, Ed would pass away at their home in Monroe at the age of 79. Ed had previous episodes with his heart, such as an episode in 2001. Paramedics were able to get his heart restarted then, but he would suffer a resulting coma for 11 weeks. Up to the moment he died, Ed never stopped believing that he would be going to a beautiful place, a place so spectacular it defied words. Lorraine would follow, almost 16 years later, passing away in her sleep on the 18th of April in 2019. She was 92 years of age at the time of her passing. Her son-in-law, Tony Spera, would make the following statement. "It is with deep sadness that I must announce that Lorraine Warren has passed away. She died peacefully in her sleep at home last night." So this was Ed and Lorraine's story. They would play a part in the story to come. And now that we have a solid understanding of the Warrens, let's get into the story of Roger and Carolyn Perron. So get ready, because this story, The Conjuring, is coming up next. In Harrisville, Rhode Island, nestled in amongst the truly idyllic scenery, lies an old colonial home. As you make your way up the dirt and gravel driveway, the trees eventually give way to the sight of an unassuming 18th century farmhouse. It is quaint and extremely beautiful in nature, adorned with faded gray wood siding. This house certainly seems like an amazing place to raise a family for those wanting to be outside a major city and experience everything that country living has to offer. For this is the thought that crossed the mind of a woman named Carolyn Perron, the matriarch of a family of 7. Carolyn was married to a man named Roger. Together, they would have 5 children. In order of oldest to youngest, they were Andrea, Nancy, Christine, Cindy, and April. As outlined in the Conjuring House's website, the homestead's history is described in the following manner. The land on which the home stands was originally deeded in 1680, surveyed by a man named John Smith, who was an original colonist of the state of Virginia. Roger Williams, who initially founded the colony of Rhode Island, was the chief inheritant of this land. Rhode Island is known as the smallest state with the largest name, officially being titled the State of Rhode Island and Providence Plantations. The property, which was initially surveyed by John Smith, yes, that John Smith, was deeded to the Richardson family for their loyalty to Roger Williams. If you recall from our previous episode about Salem and the founding of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, it was largely inhabited by Puritans. Those people who followed the word of God extremely closely and persecuted those who spoke out against their religion. It was Williams's belief that there should exist the freedom of religious worship and matters of church and state should be separated. Having these beliefs, he was expelled from the colony in Massachusetts and founded his new colony on Narragansett Bay. Here, he would push the beliefs that were unfavored before and would parcel out the land to those who would subscribe to his teachings. The entire Richardson estate was originally over 1,000 acres in size and was sold in smaller parcels to other families in the area. The descendants of those, some of which still inhabited the area of their ancestral lands to this day. As time passed, through marriage, the estate would transfer hands from the Richardson family to the Arnolds. The Arnold family used the property as part of the Underground Railroad in order to shepherd slaves attempting to escape into Canada. The home, as it currently stands, was built in 1736, which was impressive as it predated the Declaration of Independence by 40 years. Like many homes on the eastern seaboard, it was battered and ravaged by many hurricanes, even surviving the extremely destructive Great New England Hurricane of 1938. The home was built solely with clapboard and provided minimal insulation value. With the historical part of the home's history laid out, and believe me, we're saving much of the Arnold family's history until later, we can finally meet the Perrons. Now, it's my own belief that free will does exist, but it is limited and guided by the hand of fate. I know I'm treading into the realm of predestination, but more so to the concept that paths cross for a reason, and that generally things that are meant to happen do. Keep that in mind as we go forward into this story. The Perron story begins approximately 2.5 years before they moved to Harrisville. They are a family of 7, Carolyn, Roger, and their children. The children were all very close to one another, the best of friends and borderline inseparable. One day, after returning home from work, Roger brought home an adorable little African Basenji puppy. The entire family knew how wonderful this dog was, and possibly no one more enamored with it than Andrea. As far as she was concerned, this was her dog. Andrea remembered her mother scooping up the puppy. With a smile on her face, she said, "A special dog needs a special name." Carolyn looked up, closed her eyes, and came up with that name, Bathsheba. None of the other family members had heard the name before, but it would become important in events only a few years later. Unfortunately, the family would only have the dog for a few years, as it met a tragic end, being hit by a car. The family would get a second dog at a later point and named him Schultz, and had at least one cat. One evening, while taking Andrea to one of her music lessons, Carolyn would stop into a store and pick up a newspaper. Being that they were very busy, she wouldn't have time to read the newspaper until later that evening, after all of her children had gone to bed. When she finally settled in, she immediately noticed an ad for a property that looked like it jumped right off the page. After 8 months of searching for a new home for her family, she had finally found it. Carolyn was enamored with this beautiful 10-bedroom, centuries-old farmhouse in Harrisville, Rhode Island. The house, complete with a barn just off the back left and a creek that ran through the estate. She picked up her phone and called her realtor sometime around 9 or 9:30 that evening and requested a showing the following day. The realtor was able to get a showing of the home, and both she and Carolyn would drive up to check it out the following morning. Walking around its beautiful grounds, she fell in love with it. It presented as a beautiful home to raise her children and was everything she was looking for. As Andrea stated, her mother was also a student of history and would spend much of her time reading books of a historical context. So, the chance to own one of the first homes in Rhode Island was extremely enticing to her. Without so much as a second thought, Carolyn emptied out the family savings account, leaving just enough money for groceries, and wrote an earnest money check in the amount of $500, agreeing to a purchase price on the home of $72,000 total. The hardest part of this whole transaction would be convincing Roger. When she initially broke it to him, his chiefest concern was if they could get the check back that she wrote. Another major concern was he knew they hadn't built any equity in the home they were already living in. Carolyn protested. She told him how amazing it was and stated that he had to see it for himself and that it was the real estate deal of a lifetime. So they packed up the family in their old station wagon and drove up to Harrisville. Like Carolyn, as soon as Roger laid eyes on the property, he too fell in love with it. On this trip, Roger and Carolyn would also meet the current owner, an elderly man named Earl Kenyon, who was described as a true gentleman. Mr. Kenyon was born on the 23rd of January in 1893 and was a native of Burrillville. He married Sarah Butterworth on the 12th of June 1917, and together they had one son. Sarah would pass away in 1967. Originally, Mr. Kenyon didn't want to sell the home, but his son would pressure him into selling it so that he wouldn't be living on his own, and trying to upkeep a property of that size in his later 70s. Mr. Kenyon would eventually acquiesce and agreed to sell the home. Roger and Carolyn closed on the home in December of 1970, but didn't move in until the new year. Carolyn didn't want to uproot her family over the Christmas holiday, and Mr. Kenyon needed some extra time to pack and move all of his things. The Perrons moved in on the 11th of January in 1971 in the midst of a major snowstorm. Normally, as it seems with most stories of this type, there's a bit of a settling in period in which no paranormal activity happens for the first few days or weeks. For the Perrons, it was as soon as they crossed the threshold. One of the telltale signs something was wrong that they didn't pick up on was the way their animals behaved. Schultz had no interest in going inside the house and would cower and cry if he got too near it. Even their cat would not go easily, spitting and hissing in protest. Andrea was given a box by her father and asked to take it to her mother in the kitchen. When she passed through the dining room, she noticed Mr. Kenyon packing some of his last things and another man, who was oddly dressed, standing with him. Being the polite young girl that she was, she said hello, but was met with no response. She didn't find this too strange, as there had been many delivery trucks and movers traipsing through the house. When she got to the kitchen, Andrea asked her mother who the man in the dining room was with Mr. Kenyon, to which Carolyn replied that there was no other man in there with him. Andrea protested, but the same question would then be asked by Cindy, then Christine. She thought her daughters were playing some kind of joke on her until Nancy entered and said that she saw the man in the dining room with Mr. Kenyon disappear. They continued moving in, and would begin to get settled into the new house. From the very beginning, something felt off. There was a feeling of unbelievable sadness that they couldn't shake, coupled with feelings of things watching them. The initial phenomena that occurred in the home was not physical, but more intuitive. Their house, being centuries old and of pure clapboard design, meant that there was no insulation anywhere in the house. The home was heated by an old system in the basement, and it didn't help that every fireplace in the house had been bricked up. The day after they moved in, Mr. Kenyon returned to the house to see how they were doing and to drop off the keys to the property. Before he left, he asked to speak with Roger privately, and the two would step out for a short walk. Not much is known about the specifics of what they said, but the advice Roger was given was chilling. Roger, leave the lights on when the sun goes down. For the sake of your family, leave the lights on at night. Now, those who already know this story know why this is important and where this story is going. Roger had no idea this was something related to the paranormal or diabolical, but more so that the home was secluded, and with the only bathroom being on the main floor and him having a family of 6 women, that it was more of a safety thing. Even after they met their neighbors, they were told to be careful. One of the neighbors even told them that they never remembered a time they hadn't seen the light on, every light on, in that house, every single night. Around the family's 3rd night in the house is when the first frightening things began happening. Andrea, while trying to sleep one night, was woken by her sister Cindy asking to share her bed. Wanting the extra body heat, in the dead of winter, Andrea couldn't refuse, and Cindy was more than welcome. Cindy said that she was frightened and she could hear voices all around her bed that grew louder and louder. Andrea thought this was bizarre, as the way the house was laid out, all of the girls' rooms were connected. Andrea was in the middle bedroom, with Cindy and April on one side, and Christine and Nancy on the other. The girls always kept the doors between them open, but still, Andrea heard nothing. Cindy told her they kept repeating the same thing.
There are 7 dead soldiers buried in the walls.
After this, minor, more traditional paranormal things continued to happen. There would be strange noises from places there was no living thing. When Carolyn asked Mr. Kenyon about this, the only reply he gave was, "It's just swallows in the chimney." This was just an old way of saying he wasn't going to discuss it. Carolyn chalked this up to the home being old. The noises really could have been attributed to anything. Objects would begin to move, and things were never where they were left before. Carolyn really noticed this behavior when, after cleaning, she would notice very neat and tidy piles of dirt left on the floor in the kitchen. She really thought this was her daughters playing tricks on her, but they professed they had no involvement. Carolyn would also hear strange noises from the kitchen, like the sound of nails or something metal scraping against the kettle. Of course, this too was left to imagination, and she couldn't place how those sounds were being made. The girls, who were so close, even began to grow apart and become angry with one another. It all began in Cindy and April's room. Their toys began being found under the bed, which was strange to them as they never put them there. The girls, much like the situation with the dirt in the kitchen, would blame their older sisters, saying they were only causing mischief. The older girls would take offense to this until their things too began to move, which they pinned on Cindy and April. These minor things would be the beginning of a rift between the five. When the family were at odds with one another, this was when the paranormal behavior began to escalate. Apparitions began appearing, but they were mostly benevolent, and the family never really minded having them around. They were harmless, and if they really did anything out of normal behavior, it was more mischievous than malevolent. One of the spirits was an older woman that took a liking to the girls and usually stayed in Cindy and April's room. She was viewed as a caring spirit, and Cindy even reported being kissed on the forehead by her. The girls interacted with many of the initially presented spirits, viewing them as playmates who were comforting and kept them company. One of these spirits even befriended April, who, unlike the rest of the girls, stayed home because she was not yet of school age. One day, while she was playing in the bedroom upstairs, she noticed a set of eyes peeking out from the closet in the upper part of one of the rooms. There was also a part of the chimney in this room. She would later describe this boy as being petite with platinum blonde hair. He had pale lips and appeared to be about 5 to 6 years old. He was wearing old clothing and had pale green eyes that made him look as though they were almost always on the verge of tears. The boy peeked out of the closet and looked around, almost as though he were terrified, and was double-checking to make sure they were alone and that the coast was clear. He was fascinated by April's toys, and it was as though he had never seen toys like that before. He would communicate with April telepathically and introduced himself to her as Oliver Richardson, the same last name as the original family on the estate. April and Oliver became the best of friends throughout her entire tenure at the house. April wouldn't tell any of her other family members until later in life, when she was in her 30s, and Andrea mentions that it was one of the saddest moments for April when the family eventually moved out of the house, the fact that she had to leave her friend behind. Soon, these benevolent spirits began giving way to those far more malevolent. One afternoon, the girls were all playing a popular game they loved, known as hide and clap. For those who haven't seen the Conjuring film, where this was demonstrated, I'll give you a short rundown on the rules, as it's similar to the children's game Marco Polo. The girl who is it gets blindfolded, and the other participants run and hide while the other is counting. When the one who is it claps, all of the others must clap as well. If someone is caught, they become it, and the game starts over. During one of these games, Cindy thought she would find a hiding place in the woodshed, in a box. She climbed in, pulled the lid, which was light enough to move, over top of her. After a short time, she realized she would never be found in the box, as it wasn't fair, and got up to get out. She began to panic when the lid to the box would not budge. She tried as hard as she could, but it wouldn't move. Cindy was terrified and trapped in that stiflingly hot and pitch black box. She began to scream and cry and was eventually found by Nancy, who found her drenched in sweat and absolutely distraught. It was after this moment that the girls really noticed the spirits were beginning to turn on them. They sought the help of the only people they knew they could turn to, their parents, Roger and Carolyn. When the girls laid bare everything that had been happening to them, their parents were visibly confused. They had no idea what was going on. They didn't believe there were spirits in the house, as benevolent spirits had generally been ignoring Roger and Carolyn and only interacted with the girls. They had, however, noticed strange things happening, such as Carolyn with the misplaced items in the kitchen. Roger, when coming home from work, also noticed that a strange smell as soon as he had opened the door would make itself known. A smell that he could only describe akin to rotting flesh. Carolyn even began noticing terrifying things as well, and would soon meet the one who would torment her the most in all of the years to come. One morning, before dawn, Carolyn remembered waking up to the sight of something moving across the room. It was a tall, dark figure of a woman. It was still dark, so she couldn't exactly make out many of the woman's features, but noticed that her head and neck were bent at an almost impossible angle. The woman demanded that Carolyn and her family depart from the house immediately and find somewhere else to live. If they did not leave, this woman threatened to drive them out with doom and gloom. This was absolutely frightening to Carolyn, but unfortunately, their hands were financially tied. The pair used about every dollar they had to purchase the home and were hit even harder as the weeks went on. A pipe burst in the house, and having no money to repair it, they were forced to sell all but 8.5 acres of their property. As much as they may have wanted to heed this entity's words, they were unable to leave. It was at this point, for Carolyn, that her experience would transfer from the stage of infestation to oppression. It started by her feeling slight pinching sensations in her skin that would escalate to her being awoken in the dead of night from physical slaps across her face. Because of these things, Carolyn's behavior even seemed to change. This once bright and beautiful young woman was suffering, beginning to lose weight and appearing very thin. Paired with the physical torments were the escalation of previous behaviors. Objects would be taken from, at times, right behind her back, and she would find them in completely different parts of the house. Because of this increase in activity, the girls began to feel presences of absolute evil and anger that would traipse through the house, and they could sense when it was close. Not knowing how or why things were happening, Carolyn would begin to conduct research into the property. In this research, she found a town record that was known as the Black Book of Burleville. This was a record of their town and had records of their property, which was known as the Old Arnold Estate. Carolyn began looking into it and was only scratching the surface of how dark this property's history truly was. As was legal in Rhode Island, sellers of a property did not have to disclose prior events that happened on the property or in the home to prospective buyers. It's believed the Perrons had no knowledge of any events that happened there and may possibly have or have not been notified by Mr. Kenyon. The property, after transferred from the Richardson family to the Arnold family, would be occupied by 8 generations of Arnolds before the purchase of Roger and Carolyn. There was absolutely no shortage of horrible, dark, and twisted things that happened here. There were many violent and disturbing deaths, including those of children. There were several drownings, a murder, a person who died from ingesting poison, and 4 deaths of people who mysteriously froze to death on the property. There was also one reported suicide, which was that of Mrs. John Arnold. Mrs. Arnold hanged herself in the barn at the age of 93 and was discovered swinging by her family. It was believed she was so distraught after the death of her husband that she just couldn't go on. One of the more gruesome events was the rape and murder of 11-year-old Prudence Arnold by a farmhand who worked on the property. The records Carolyn was able to find indicated that Prudence was found with her neck sliced open. Even Prudence's uncle, named Johnny, would hang himself in the attic. This was just meant to give you a brief look at the history of the Arnolds through their 8 generations, and where we'll continue our story. After finding out all of these things, this caused a great amount of added worry and fear to come unto Carolyn. This is not a good thing, as spirits and demons can feed off of that negative energy. Even the phrase Cindy heard about the 7 dead soldiers in the walls even seemed to make sense to her. Another spirit would begin to make frequent visits to the girls at night. This was a spirit they named Manny, who was described as a man who bore a crooked smile and would watch them every night, standing in the dark corners of their bedroom. Routine activity began to become greater and more violent. Furniture now began to move in plain view and would even be upended at any moment. Doors and windows would open and slam shut, sometimes even resisting closure from the family. The girls began to be attacked nightly from different spirits. They suffered the pulling of their hair and bedclothes, and their limbs would be pulled. One spirit that frequented them was known as Mama. The spirit would cry and drone on and on, only repeating the phrase, Mama. It's possible that this might have been the spirit of young Prudence Arnold, who might have likely cried out to her mother before her death. Another spirit would roam the house at night and yell at the girls repeatedly to get out. They would all run into Andrea's room as they felt safer together. Some of the things that happened to the girls will never be spoken about. There are some hints of molestation, but Andrea has only ever offered up that the spirit was a bad man who terrorized young girls. They would sometimes smell the same horrible stench that Roger did. This would bring phenomena of its own, sometimes the shaking of beds or levitation. As I mentioned previously, the family had a lot of trouble keeping the home warm throughout the winter. The heating system was located in the basement, which was an area of the home that all members of the family refused to go into. When the heating system would malfunction, Roger would have to go down and get it working again. Roger remained skeptical of the things that were happening, but always proceeded down to the basement with caution, never failing to look over his shoulder and check around every corner. The family felt that whatever horrible thing was attacking them lived in the basement. One of the most evil and terrifying stories to come from this haunting is the one that I'll tell now. Again, I don't want to share too many of their specific haunting stories, as Andrea Perron's books are the true source of everything that happened with this haunting, and there is so much to discover within them. Andrea had awoken one night, but couldn't tell whether or not it was the middle of the night or very early in the morning. She was experiencing a situation similar to that of sleep paralysis. Andrea heard her mother screaming, but she was unable to move to help her. She was frightened, and something seemed very strange. She was having some form of outer body experience as she could see down into her parents' room, almost from a perspective of having watched them from the ceiling. She noticed her mother awake, sitting up, terrified and recoiling into the upper parts of her bed. Carolyn's eyes were locked onto something in the room, something that drew ever closer towards her. It had no feet and was gliding across the floor. Carolyn, recoiling further and further towards and up her headboard, was trying to get away. Next to her, Roger was sound asleep. When the entity came into view, it was wearing a long brown and gray linen dress, cinched tightly around the body. It had a wide belt and lace feature that wound up and around its neck. Its neck was broken, and its head appeared to have just hung there, supernaturally. The head was described as a desiccated hornet's nest with 2 black sockets for eyes and 2 tiny holes for a nose. It had thin lips and horrible, jagged yellow teeth. There were wild sprigs of hair, and this entire entity was covered in cobwebs. Carolyn, screaming, was doing everything she could to wake up Roger, yanking on his hair as hard as she could. The entity was finally upon her. She was terrified. She pulled the covers back from Roger, and she saw the claw marks on his back that had eviscerated the skin. Now it was on top of her. The only thing she could think was, "God, help me." When she opened her eyes, it was gone. Andrea remembered falling back asleep, purely exhausted from the terror of what happened. She estimated that the time was around 5:30 in the morning. She would awake again a half hour later, free of whatever was holding her down, and jumped out of bed. She ran down to check on her mother, who was sitting in the parlor, sketching something with a pencil. When Andrea drew closer, she knew the drawing. It was the bent neck woman. She told her mother what she had saw with her own eyes, what Carolyn had just gone through. The two swore that they wouldn't tell the rest of the family, else it would deeply upset them. When they looked up to the old grandfather clock, it had stopped at 5:15 a.m., which happened to be the very time of every major manifestation the Perrons experienced. After this event, Carolyn would call on her friend Barbara. She was a paranormal investigator and friend of the family. Barbara's suggestion to Carolyn was to get help to figure out what was happening. She would suggest a local couple who were guest lecturing nearby named Ed and Lorraine Warren, and ask them if they could come and take a look. In October of 1973, Carolyn took that advice and attended one of the Warrens' lectures. Afterward, she met with Ed and Lorraine and informed them about all of the things the family had been experiencing over the last 2 years. On listening to Carolyn's stories, Ed and Lorraine became very intrigued and decided they would help the Perrons. This was also of benefit to Roger and Carolyn, as Ed and Lorraine never took any money from the owners of the homes they investigated. One of Carolyn's reasons for having waited as long as she did was that she had apprehension no one would want to help, that she would tell her story and that no one would believe her. Roger, the skeptic, also did not want to say anything as he feared it would only make his wife's disposition worse, and he didn't want her to have any more cause for worry than she had already been exhibiting. He would be initially reluctant to accept Ed and Lorraine's help, but did so as it seemed to comfort his wife. It wouldn't be long before Ed and Lorraine arrived to the Perrons' farm. Within moments of their arrival, Lorraine began to walk the main floor of the home, eventually coming to the kitchen. She stopped and told Roger and Carolyn, "I sense a dark presence here, and her name is Bathsheba." Of course, Lorraine would be referencing the spirit of Bathsheba Sherman, who once lived on the property. Carolyn saw this as a validation for what she was experiencing, and she had come across that name in her research. Now, the Bathsheba that was portrayed in the Conjuring movie and the real-life Bathsheba Sherman were referencing the same person. However, her movie story is far different than who she was as a real person. It's important, with Lorraine believing her to be the most evil entity in the home, that we explore the real Bathsheba's story in greater detail. As to whether or not she was guilty of what she was accused of, I'll let you decide that yourself. Bathsheba Thayer was born in 1812 and had what was described as a contented childhood. It's rumored that she may have possibly had relation to Mary Esty, one of the victims of the Salem witch trials. Bathsheba was known for her beauty, of which many women were envious. Bathsheba married a man named Judson Sherman in 1844. When she was 32 years of age, the pair would have a daughter named Julia in 1845. Bathsheba was accused of murder after her daughter was found dead with a hole the size of a sewing needle, having punctured the skin near the base of her skull. One theory was that Bathsheba was caught vowing allegiance to the devil by her husband in 1849. She would curse all future generations who would live on her land and would climb to a tree and hang herself. This is believed to be incorrect for the reasons that we'll get into. She was arrested for the murder of her daughter and charged with those crimes. However, she was never convicted as there was no concrete evidence pinning the murder to her. After this, Bathsheba bore the unfortunate rumor around the town that she was a witch who sacrificed her own child to the devil in exchange for eternal beauty. The condition of her deal was believed that she would be granted this eternal beauty, but in exchange, her body would be turned to stone at the time of her death, and that the devil would doom her to torment the living for all eternity. Tragedy would find her again as another child died while they were in her care. She was never charged with this death, but it only fueled rumors of her dark practices. Bathsheba was also known for being a very unkind woman. She was known for being very cruel to any of the hired help on her property, and was even known to starve and beat them. One of the reasons for her unpleasant demeanor was that it was believed she was of a well-off family, being raised with means and the amenities of a city. When she was married to Judson, she was shepherded off to the country as he ran a produce business on his 200-acre farm in Harrisville. Even in the only known photo, which is the art for this episode, she is staring off at something out of view standing by herself in the middle of the field while everyone else is in small groups and is posed for the picture. While no records of these children exist, some believe that Bathsheba and Judson had 3 more children: Edward, who was born in 1847, Herbert in 1849, and George in 1855. The stories of Edward and George were that they didn't survive past their 7th birthday. Likely, this could have been from many of the bacterial illnesses that were going around this area at the time. Even in the aforementioned photo, if you look very closely, Bathsheba is seen wearing some kind of face covering. Bathsheba would remain on the property into her early 70s until her death on the 25th of May in 1885. She was predeceased by her husband Judson 4 years earlier. Bathsheba's cause of death was paralysis induced by a stroke. Now, this isn't exactly the same as turning her body to literal stone, but paralysis was as close as it was going to get. Bathsheba's official record had her passing away as previously mentioned in 1885. This would make the hanging story of 1849 only a rumor. She was buried next to her husband in the Harrisville Cemetery in Rhode Island. One key point to take away here is that if the town really believed Bathsheba to be a witch, they wouldn't have given her a full burial. If you remember from the Salem episode, witches are buried in shallow graves with no markings. In addition, Bathsheba had never lived or worked on the Arnold estate, so she had no real tie to that property, other than having dropped by on occasion, like seen in the photo. It's very important to know that the way that she was portrayed in The Conjuring and the real-life person may have shared some similarities, but the movie did nothing but vilify the real Bathsheba Sherman. It's easy to tell that there are many who don't look into the actual facts about historical people, as Bathsheba's headstone was vandalized to the point of breaking. It was snapped in half, repaired, and subsequently had to be removed because of the way the film portrayed her and the resulting negative attention she received. It's possible that she may have been guilty of some of these crimes or even having made a pact with the devil, but none of this was proven and there was no evidence tying her to anything. Bathsheba Sherman was never convicted, and the real person remains an innocent woman. Andrea Perron has even attested that the only person who believed Bathsheba to be the most evil entity in the home was Lorraine Warren. The entirety of the family believed the most wicked to be the bent-neck woman, who they believed to be the spirit of Mrs. Arnold, the only person known to have hanged themselves and actually been tied to the property. The Warrens conducted their investigation over the course of the next few years, coming to stay with the family every so often. One of the major events that happened to Carolyn was while she was lying on a couch in the parlor. She was awoken to a tremendous stabbing pain in her calf. When she got up, she noticed it was bleeding profusely, and there was already a pool of blood where she had been lying. When Carolyn cleaned herself up and the bleeding had clotted, she noticed that there was a small circular wound in the back of her leg, almost as though she had been stabbed with a needle. Lorraine believed that this was the same needle that Bathsheba had used to kill her child, that she pulled over into death and used to attack the living. This entire ordeal was emotionally exhausting for Carolyn, but Roger had a different perspective. Although he was skeptical, he knew something was going on. His treatment from this evil entity was much different than Carolyn's. For Roger, this entity turned into some kind of succubus, and would caress him and whisper pleasurable things in his ear. It saw Carolyn as a threat to its position as mistress of the home and did everything it could to terrorize her. Lorraine would categorize this spirit as one of the darkest and most wicked spirits she had ever met. She would be able to keep the spirit away at times by invoking the name of God, much like Carolyn had in her thoughts before. One of the key beliefs that Lorraine had was that the haunting was made much worse because the Perron family was non-religious, and had they have been, they could have used prayer or some divine intercession to help with their hauntings. Take this how you will, but I'll interject a quote here from famed Catholic exorcist Malachi Martin that I always remember. Not to believe in evil is not to be armed against it. Not necessarily stating that some must be religious for salvation, but more so that none should shy away from the existence of evil if we believe in good. Even more simply, if we want to go the science route, grounded in fact, with Isaac Newton's third law of motion. For every action, there must be an equal and opposite reaction. Thus, if a person holds the belief in God, or benevolence, or even is not religious and simply believes in good deeds, that simply good things and actions cannot exist, else we discount the possibility of an equally powerful devil or malevolent spirit or bad things that must exist in direct counteraction to good. Ed and Lorraine were unsuccessful at being able to drive out the spirits plaguing the Perrons. The only thing they could do, or at least they believed they could do, was hold a seance in order to speak to the spirits and attempt to drive them off. Contrary to the film, no exorcism ever took place, and Ed and Lorraine have never claimed to have performed any exorcism, as that is the religious rite that requires church authorization. The seance would take place in August of 1973. On the day before Halloween, Ed and Lorraine contacted the Perrons to let them know that a crew of their people would be coming by the house to assist with the process. When the knock came, there was a priest, a medium, and a technical crew to do sound and video documentation. They were all met with the absolute displeasure of Roger, for none knew it yet, but the resulting seance would be horrific. Up to her death, Lorraine Warren had never spoken about it and would often be disturbed if it was brought up to her. Though there were no children allowed to be present, Andrea and her sister Cindy snuck down to the basement to witness the events. Andrea has stated that this was the only time in the house that she feared for the lives of her family, as they were locked in a literal battle of life and death, good versus evil. When the seance began, the medium opened a portal to the spirit world, but they were unable to contain what came through. It was only a short time before Carolyn started exhibiting strange behavior. She appeared to become possessed, although Andrea attests that she was only ever attacked, not possessed. She started speaking in a language that was not human. Although there are many dead languages in our world, this was possible that it could have been an early language like Aramaic, or one that has never existed at all. The tone of her voice changed, and she began levitating. She was then thrown across the room, and back, and thrown again, as though she were some kind of rag doll. At some point during this process, after seeing this, Cindy collapsed. Andrea caught her, but was struggling to hang on and feared that she may be pulled through the door into view of the spirits. What seemed like it went on for hours was only a matter of minutes. Carolyn was contorted into all manners of position, and at one point, she became so curled up in a ball it was a miracle that every bone in her body didn't. Eventually, the session would close, and Carolyn returned to normal. Roger attempted to rush to the side of his wife when Ed held him back, not knowing if she was still afflicted. Roger was infuriated. He punched Ed in the face and raced to his wife. The seance was a complete failure. The medium could not contain what she invited into the home, and that entity went straight for Carolyn. Roger would turn to Ed and Lorraine and tell them, "No more. Get out of my house. We're done with you." Andrea stated that the seance changed every person in that room for the remainder of their lives, and that it was proof enough that evil, in its purest and most absolute form, exists in this world. The seance left the Perron family scarred, and would be the first time that the Warrens were ever thrown out of a home while conducting investigation there. Overall, through the years of investigation and attempting to free the Perrons' home of spirits, Ed and Lorraine were unsuccessful at actually accomplishing anything there. There was no resolution, as the movie portrayed, and the home was still haunted after all of the dust had settled. There were no ill feelings from the Warren side, although both Ed and Lorraine, as they drove away from the farmhouse disguised as a portal, were gravely concerned for the well-being of the family. The Perrons, still in a tight spot financially, would have to endure that home for another number of years. As each of the Perron children grew old enough to, they moved out of the house as soon as they were able. Roger and Carolyn would eventually be able to sell the house and move in 1980. Their landing spot was in Cherokee County, Georgia. They actively worked to try to turn the page on past events in their lives for the next number of years. The majority of the Perron family has been relatively quiet on the subjects that happened in their house, not wanting to dig up old skeletons. The most vocal has been Andrea, who continues to do interviews and tell the family's story after finally having realized the time was right to tell it. She brought her family's story to us, publishing it in a 3-volume book series known as House of Darkness, House of Light. These books tell the story of what her family went through, but how they also became closer as a family because of these experiences. I can't express enough how amazing the works in these books are, and I highly recommend you read them. Ed Warren, as mentioned in the short biography at the start of this episode, passed away in 2005. On his deathbed, he professed to Lorraine how important it was to ensure this story was told. Lorraine was able to line up a movie and approach the Perrons, asking them to be part of the telling. She would tell Carolyn that the money the studio was offering was life-changing money. Carolyn needed time to think and would sleep on it. That evening, for the first time she left the house in Harrisville, she was attacked by some dark entity in her basement while she was doing a load of laundry. This terrified Carolyn and dug up everything she tried to bury and put behind her. She called Lorraine the following morning, asking her to never contact the family again. Because of this, The Conjuring is based solely on the accounts and information contained in the Warrens' case files and had no input from the family. Thus, there are many inaccuracies in the film, the chiefest of which being the vilification of Bathsheba Sherman as the main evil. Of course, as mentioned before, Bathsheba was only believed to be the most evil entity by Lorraine Warren. This wouldn't be the last engagement that Lorraine would have with the family, as she invited Andrea to a private screening of the movie titled The Conjuring. Lorraine would profess to Andrea how sorry she was they weren't able to help their family. Both she and Ed had the best intentions, but from the moment they crossed the threshold of the home, they were in over their heads, and they knew it. Andrea and Lorraine would have a great relationship, and now she finds solace in the fact that Lorraine is reunited in death with Ed. In honor of Ed and Lorraine, and their belief that faith might have saved the Perrons, I'd like to leave a quote that echoes and truly paints a picture for their beliefs. The greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world that he didn't exist. If you're hearing this message, that means you made it to the end of this week's story about the haunting of the Perron family that inspired The Conjuring. I hope you enjoyed this week's episode, and I'd like to thank you very much for listening. For more information about the podcast, please visit our link directory in the show notes. Before you go, remember to hit the subscribe button so you don't miss out on any of our amazing episodes. And leave us a quick review, even if it's just hitting the star button. As the last of our bonus episodes for spooky season 2022, I'll see you again on Halloween for a story that was the inspiration behind the major film The Exorcist, a story known as The Exorcism of Roland Doe. Again, this episode will air Monday, the 31st of October, prior to our regularly scheduled Tuesday episode. And on next week's episode, Tuesday the 1st of November, we're going to have the second iteration of our folklore appendices series for all of you cryptid lovers out there. In that episode, we'll discuss the black devil dog of England, known as the Black Shuck, and the North American indigenous legend known as the Wendigo. New episodes release every Tuesday at 5 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. But for now, it's time to close the cover of the Insidious agenda. I'll see you again next week.